So that was the first part of the film, Strange Beliefs. Again, I said it echoes the material that we saw or we read on pages 332 to 334. So the idea of the classic case of the granary, right? So he goes to the Azande, and there are people sitting under this thing and it collapses and they say it was witchcraft. And he says, no, it was the termites that ate out the beams. That's what caused this to happen. And they said, of course, we know that the termites eat the beams. We know about cause and effect, but why was that person sitting there at the time? Why did it happen in that way? Why does one person get sick and one person not? Why, when two people catch the same disease, does some persons, have a strong effect and others not at all? These are questions that we might think about ourselves. You've probably been in places where two people seem to do exactly the same things, and yet one person has very different effects from these things that we want to explain scientifically. And so what Evans-Pritchard realized is that witchcraft provided something that actually science does not, which is the why, or the reason, the end reason for why these things would happen. Now, as your textbook says, he is not here talking, this is witchcraft used in the anthropological sense. It is not talking about other beliefs which are seen in a more positive light in our contemporary society. We're talking about how the people in this society view these substances and these reasons for life and especially misfortune and death. But what Evans-Pritchard here is arguing is that there is that way of life is actually logical, and that at the very end that in some ways you have to organize yourselves. Or I mean, if you organize your life, if you're in the field doing your field work and you have to do those things, that as he says, if you act as though you believe, you end up in some ways believing as you act. And so he had to sort of organize his own life in that way, and ended up I won't say he doesn't go native, or that's not a thing in anthropology, but you end up having to question your own belief systems in relationship to those you are studying with. So I want to use this example as a way of talking about something that we began talking about in the last section, but we'll spend the rest of this unit exploring, which is the idea of culture or learned behavior, coupled to the idea of ethnographic fieldwork in anthropology. So in anthropology, we talked about this, that and the film plays this out very well. There was an idea in European and American society that other people were in some ways primitive, that they were wrong, that they had inferior ideas, and that those ideas were often linked in this colonial structure to their race. And so in contrast to that, and I would say that anthropologists, again, they were part of that system. They were part of the colonial system. They benefited from the colonial hierarchy. They may have been slightly differently placed, but a lot of them, they were not necessarily good people to think differently about this, and it took them a while to think differently. But eventually anthropologists said that, hey, it's not that other people have inferior languages, it's simply a different way of looking at the world, and it might be interesting to think about the patterns of language. We talked about that in the last class. In this class, we're talking about religion and rituals, that people in other societies may have different kinds of rituals, but we can see some underlying continuities as well as interesting ways or things that we should study about them. In the next class, a week from today, we'll be talking about economics and subsistence and how people make a living. And in some ways, looking at the way different societies organize their economic activity. again, in the early days, people from European societies didn't believe that, say, hunters and gatherers had an economic system. And so it is anthropologists who actually would go and sort of describe and outline the ways in which people were organizing themselves in respect to their environment. After that, we'll be talking about political systems, how people organize themselves, how they are able to govern themselves, perhaps in the absence of those things that we think about as courts and police and laws, that there are other ways of organizing yourselves politically. And then we'll be talking in the next units about ideas about kinship, about relatedness, about marriage, about different ways of making families, about gender, about sexuality. And the idea from anthropology is really a kind of simple one, which is that culture, life is patterned. There are patterns. We learn those patterns. And by going in and talking to people and observing and analyzing what they're doing, we can also learn those patterns for ourselves, that we can learn what people think and believe, and in some ways talk about it in an intelligent way. And we can compare it to our own. So part of this next unit will be going through some of these things that, again, people in European and American societies tended to believe that other people didn't have marriage patterns that were considered normal, for example. And so what we're going to be doing is trying to get some appreciation for the different ways in which people organize their lives. Now, I would say here that being able to appreciate that other people have different ideas is a beginning point. It's a good thing in terms of that's where we're going to start from that. If that's all we get to, that's probably good enough. But I would like to push it slightly beyond that, in the sense that we should also use that appreciation or use that cross-cultural comparison to bring it back to our own assumptions and to our own categories, and to ask what we're doing and if it makes sense in our own lives. In addition to that, in the second to last chapter is about inequality in social life. And that's something that we've been talking about even in terms of rites of passage and rituals, is understanding how these things, culture itself, is shaped by power and unequal relationships within and between societies. So again, good to be appreciative of other people's beliefs, but we also need to understand what is going on between people and within other societies. As we saw in the film, one of the things they are thinking about is colonialism. And if the anthropologists or the anthropological film crew is there to take their land. So this is still a live issue for people in many parts of the world and within our own society. And then in our final chapter is about applied anthropology. And so that's kind of taking it a step further. Oftentimes we think about anthropology as something that is supposed to observe and analyze, but kind of then we have the classroom, but that's where we stop. And the final chapter will be about applied anthropology, or how to make these insights meaningful for changing perhaps our own way of life, or altering the relationships if people are interested in medical anthropology or development anthropology, to actually participate in the change process in which people are trying to navigate the world. So this is a kind of overview of the next, we actually have after this class, not that anyone's counting, but we have 8 classes left. We have 4 weeks left after this class. And so those are the topics that we're going to be going through: the insights from anthropology, the power inequality, and then how to apply those insights. I want to go briefly through 2 cases from this chapter which kind of illustrate what we were talking about. So going back to the idea of art, which in this chapter comes right after play. So in the old idea of art, what we might call the common assumption about art was something that certain people had in certain societies, and was something that you had in a museum or had a specific skill at. And so one of the things that anthropologists were fighting against is they were looking at different kinds of art and different kinds of expression in other societies, and were arguing that all societies have a capacity for art. We just have to be able to recognize it in different forms. And anthropologists weren't the only ones arguing this. A lot of people in the art world itself were starting to find inspiration in other societies, in other areas, and sort of looking differently at the way people make art. However, that's the big insight, right? So instead of thinking that only certain people have art, the first insight is, let's appreciate art in different societies. This is a human capacity. This isn't reserved only for certain people. But there's a kind of other side to this, and this is where some of the power and inequality starts to come in, is that when we go into and look at another society and we say, aha, let's look at this beautiful artwork, people are sometimes like, well, that's not, we don't, that's just something we are using in our life. Yeah, you're saying it's part of this ritual and I can sell it in an art auction or an art museum, but those aren't meant to be outside of the sphere of life. You're not supposed to buy and sell them. You're not supposed to dig them up or take them away. And so a lot of things got classified. Once this classification of art happens, people then attach a monetary value to it, or they try to find it in other societies. And so, one of the things that anthropologists end up thinking about, again, this issue of, well, who defines what art is? Who defines what is kind of the idea of an authentic art, which is often related to the idea that certain people in certain cultures need to produce certain kinds of things. And then something that comes up in our own lives is, are we allowed to appropriate the traditions of others? There's a really interesting discussion in this chapter of Japanese hip hop. And so, how does that happen? How is it transformed? Is it right to appropriate other art forms? So these raise some thorny issues when we try to look at the world in an anthropological way. I think, hopefully get a first and better perspective simply by appreciating that other people do have art and artistic expression, but we still have to kind of push on from there to think about some of these, the relationship between societies and within societies, about who gets to have the power to market things as art, or appropriate or decide what art is. Similarly, with the idea of religion. So as we just saw in the film, the so-called idea of strange beliefs, there was a long period of time in which European societies thought that there are only some kinds of people who had religion, and other people didn't have it. They had magic or some sort of weird primitive understanding of the world. And so one of the things anthropologists did is to say, well, I mean, if we think about religion as a system of belief and the idea of the supernatural, then everyone has religious beliefs that are worth considering on their own terms, and we have to think about them. And some of you got into the idea of shamans and how in some ways there are other religious traditions. So if we think about some of the religious traditions that we probably know, they're formal people who are designated as the religious leaders, whereas a shaman might be a much more informal structure of navigating the religious world. So it still might be considered a form of belief and a form of practice, but a very different organization of the system there. And then, we can also think about some of you got into some of the things that people do to their bodies to achieve these states of access to another realm beyond their senses. So, some really cool stuff anthropologically. But again, like I said, we should also think about how that might challenge our own notions. And so we begin with a simple idea that religion is about the supernatural, some sort of deities or things that are beyond the natural. But as we look deeper into this issue, the whole idea that the world is divided into a natural world and a supernatural world actually comes to us from Western societies, from European societies. And so we have to back up and kind of think about, well, what is religion anyway? So one of the definitions given in Levin and Schultz is not about the supernatural or the natural. It's a reality beyond that which is immediately available to the senses, which helps us, it gets away from this idea that there's a natural and a supernatural, and opens the window up a little bit larger for us to think about different kinds of religious practices. We may wonder still if the very idea of the senses and what is immediately available to the senses is itself culturally specific. But at least this is getting somewhere different. And as I said, there are various ways, various forms of hallucinogenics and dances and trances and starving yourself to try and reach that reality that is immediately, or that is beyond the senses, and that people have done all over the world for many thousands of years to try and reach into different kinds of realities. So again, this is a little bit of a preview of the way in which we're going to be looking at some, in some ways, very simple ideas that anthropologists began with, simply that we need to go and try to understand people in different societies, but which end up raising some more complicated or larger issues than that. And just to make things even more complicated, they began talking here about what they call the anthropology of ontology, which is a huge word, or I guess it's not a very long word, but it does have a lot of syllables, and you probably haven't seen it before. I'm going to try my best to explain what they mean here by the anthropology of ontology and why it might matter, because oftentimes we see these kinds of ideas and we don't know if it makes any sense. So in anthropology, we went from this idea that we've been talking about of a sort of a colonial mentality, frankly, a racist mentality in which certain people would denigrate either people in their own society or people outside of the society as not being sophisticated, not being able to think right, not having any true traditions. And so anthropologists have tried to get us to appreciate, as we've talked about, appreciate that all people have beliefs, systems, ideas of thinking, that we have to understand those inside their own context. And so then if we push beyond that again, we then look at our own beliefs and we say, well, we also learn these things in our society. We might use the beliefs of others to think about our own beliefs as also part of a learned behavior. And we might not want to be as ethnocentric as we might have been about the way that we do things. So that's, again, if we're in that part, I'm fine with that. That works for me. But if we want to push this a little bit, the idea of ontology is that in some ways, we're not just cataloging what people believe about reality, but we're trying to get at, are the things that people are saying to us, are they a different way of thinking about reality that we might use to think differently about our own life? So when there's the word ontology comes to us from the philosophers, it basically means questions of being or questions of reality. There's another word that philosophers use that they call epistemology, which is questions of knowing or questions about belief. So the question then is, when you do an anthropological study, is there one sort of given reality out there? Again, this relates in some ways to what we're talking about with language, right? Is there one given reality and people just perceive it in different ways based on their cultural tradition? Or is there a way in which we can use what other people think to think differently about our own reality? A couple examples. The first one, I'm going to do the second one they use first. In some societies, when they are approaching especially certain non-human animals like bear or jaguars, they consider them to be persons. Not, I think they missay it a little bit here, not necessarily human persons, but as other kinds of persons. And that in these societies, certain very powerful beings, shamans, can navigate the personhood between the human animal and the non-human animal, and that both are equally persons. And things get really kind of freaky sometimes because you have people turning into different non-human animals, and that's the mark of a very powerful person. Now, you might say, well, that can't be right. But what would happen if we started to relate to our non-human animal friends, not just as, what we call living things, but as beings themselves, as potentially beings with personhood? How would that change the way we ethically approach our lives? Or in the image that I chose for the web post, the idea that the mountains, the surrounding area in this Andean area, and this comes up in many different societies, that the mountains are actually themselves living, that they are alive and they have a certain relationship with the people, so that there is an intercommunication. There are sacrifices that you need to make to the mountains. Now, again, you might say, well, that's not science. A mountain is just a pile of rock. But how would it change our own ethical behavior in the world if we began to think of the world around us as potentially inhabited by other living creatures? Again, this is something that pushes us further than maybe we want to be pushed, and that's all right. Like I said, if we want to stop with just, I want to appreciate other people's beliefs and I can respect other people's beliefs, we'll chill out there. But if you want to push it a little bit further and think about, well, should we, is the way that we are behaving in the world the right way to behave, or maybe we should think about these other ways of conceiving not just beliefs about reality, but reality itself. All right.